Good evening. Welcome to Boston College. My name is Barbara Radke, and I'm the Director of Continuing Education for the School of Theology and Ministry. Thank you for joining us. You're most welcome to be here. This is the 4th annual STM anniversary lecture, and we're pleased to present Beyond Catholic-Jewish Dialogue, a new paradigm for the 21st century. As part of its mission, the STM is pleased to offer an array of rich enrichment opportunities, both on campus like this one and online with non-credit courses offered through C21 Online. For this evening's program, the STM is very grateful for the support of our co-sponsor, the Boston College Center for Christian Jewish Learning, led by Father Jim Bernauer. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Father Mark Massa, S.J., Dean of the School of Theology and Ministry, to introduce our speaker.
Please let me voice my own welcome to all of you. And there are refreshments to my left, so please help yourself to those. I'm delighted to introduce Rabbi Daniel Lehmann, president of Hebrew College here in Newton, Massachusetts, as our speaker for the 4th annual STM anniversary lecture. Rabbi Lehmann is a Jewish innovator who has devoted his career to pluralistic Jewish education. On July the 1st, 2008, he became the 8th president of Hebrew College, one of the leading Jewish institutions in the United States. Rabbi Lehmann has rabbinical ordination from Yeshiva University, where he also received his undergraduate degree in philosophy. And he has done graduate work in Jewish studies and education at both New York University and Yeshiva University. He was as well a research fellow in Jewish education here in Boston at Brandeis University. Danny's 2 decades as a Jewish educator have included stints as rabbi and upper school principal at a Jewish day school in Pikesville, Maryland. Danny, I never knew about this. I'd like to hear about being the upper school principal sometime. He is also a faculty member in the Wexner Heritage Foundation Adult Learning Programs and a fellow at the Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership. He has also led training programs for Jewish day school educators at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, where he also participated in that institute's international theological conferences. A frequent lecturer on Jewish education, religious pluralism, and interfaith learning, Rabbi Lehmann has published numerous articles on religious education and interfaith learning. He was a participant in the Catholic Jewish Colloquium and in the project entitled Educating for Religious Particularism and Pluralism. In 2001, Danny received the Covenant Foundation Award for Excellence in Jewish Education and the Dr. Benjamin Shavach Award from Hebrew College for his outstanding contribution to Jewish educational leadership. This evening, he will deliver our 4th annual STM lecture with a talk entitled Beyond Catholic-Jewish Dialogue, a New Paradigm for the 21st Century. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Rabbi Daniel Lehmann.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank Dean Massa of the School of Theology and Ministry here at Boston College, as well as the Center for Christian Jewish Learning, for the gracious invitation to speak with you today and to share some thoughts about Catholic-Jewish dialogue. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, in particular celebrating the anniversary of the School of Theology and Ministry. Hebrew College, just down the road, was, until the establishment of the School of Theology and Ministry on this campus in June of 2008, the newest school for the training of clergy and religious educators in this neighborhood. Hebrew College is celebrating its 90th year, but our rabbinical school was established less than 10 years ago when we moved from Brookline here to Newton. On behalf of Hebrew College, I would like to take this opportunity to formally welcome the School of Theology and Ministry to the community. As the newest member of the Boston Theological Institute, this consortium of theological schools, seminaries, and graduate programs, Hebrew College enjoys a formal collaboration with the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, as well as the Boston College Department of Theology, as part of the consortium. But more importantly, we are colleagues in the preparation and training of religious leaders, and it's about that I want to focus our attention this afternoon. In the Jewish liturgical calendar, we are now in a very important period of the year, the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, the 10 days of repentance that extend from Rosh Hashanah through Yom Kippur. In keeping with this period of repentance and introspection in the Jewish calendar, I have a confession to make. And as I look around this room and think about where I am, I suppose I am in the right place for such a confession. So here it goes. I always imagined if I was not born a Jew, if I did not become a rabbi as a part of my commitment to Judaism and the Jewish people, I imagine I might be a Catholic. In fact, if I had to adopt another religious identity, I'm fairly certain it would be Catholicism. I imagine I would be a priest, and most certainly a Jesuit priest. Of course, my wife has always been concerned about this fantasy. Nonetheless, it's particularly significant to be here in this great Jesuit institution of higher learning, and particularly to honor this School of Theology and Ministry, where religious leadership, priests as well as other religious leaders, lay and professional, are trained. And I want to try to present to you some thoughts that I hope will move us beyond the current state of engagement between Catholicism and Judaism, at least here in the Boston area. The relationship between Catholicism and Judaism has undergone an incredible transformation during the 45 plus years since the Vatican II. Catholicism has done groundbreaking theological work, as evidenced by Nostra Aetate, 1965, guidelines and suggestions for the implementation of Nostra Aetate, notes on the correct way to present Jews and Judaism in preaching catechesis, the establishment of full diplomatic relationships between the Holy See and the State of Israel, and the various statements, particularly those by Pope John Paul II, about Judaism and the Jewish people throughout his papacy. There has also been a great deal of organizational engagement between the church and the Jewish community on many levels that have brought us together in ways unimaginable even a half a century ago. Pope Benedict made a clear statement just a few weeks ago on the first day of his trip back to his homeland of Germany, when he met with leaders of the Jewish community and told this group, which included rabbis and other leaders assembled in the German parliament building, the Reichstag. And he said as follows: "It seems to me that we Christians must also become increasingly aware of our own inner affinity with Judaism." He also said, and I quote, "It is clear to us that a loving relationship of mutual understanding between Israel," and I think he means here the Jewish people, "and the church, each respecting the existence of the other, still has further to grow and needs to be built into the heart of our proclamation of the faith." And I would like to add that despite the various concerns that have been voiced by members of the Jewish community about Pope Benedict's actions in relationship to Jewish issues, and I think there are serious issues there, I would like to build upon his call to continue to grow, develop, and deepen the relationship between Catholicism and Judaism. But I want to try to take it in a somewhat different direction than what we have experienced in the past. And I want to start by looking at the current state of affairs here in Boston. The relationship in Boston between Catholicism and Judaism, or the Catholic community and the Jewish community, I would describe as cooperative, but frankly, inactive. Beyond the important work of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning here at Boston College, which focuses most of its activities here on this campus, the only active, ongoing program between Catholics and Jews listed on the website of the Archdiocese of Boston is the program New Directions, a joint Anti-Defamation League Archdiocese program for Catholic and Jewish religious teachers, mostly Catholic. That's it. So my question is, first of all, why is there relatively little activity between us at this moment? And I think there are compelling answers to that question. First of all, there was a lot of energy for decades after the Holocaust on attempting to engage one another, understand one another, even create some sense of rapprochement. But we are more distant from that shockwave of the Holocaust here in 2011. And it is important to acknowledge that a great deal has been accomplished in the aftermath, but there's still more to be done, and perhaps we're losing a bit of our steam. I also would like to suggest that both communities are more focused right now internally. There are challenges to religious identity from secular society, which force us to look inwards and to concentrate energies on trying to stave off assimilation. Obviously, the sex abuse crisis in the church has required a great deal of attention here in Boston, throughout the country, and I know it has occupied in many, many different ways and levels the cardinal's attention. The concern within the Jewish community about further assimilation and intra-Jewish conflicts have certainly sapped a great deal of energy. There's also been, I think, a retrenchment in exclusivist categories. For example, I think from at least a Jewish perspective, Dominus Jesus, that important document, has been a difficult one for us in terms of its turn towards more exclusivist orientation. And I think there has been a significant response to the more radical visions of pluralism espoused by people like Leonard Swidler, Paul Knitter on the Catholic side, David Hartman, Yitz Greenberg on the Jewish side, and there's been a kind of pendulum swing to some extent towards the other side. I also would be remiss if I didn't mention the complexities, ongoing complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship and how that impacts Catholic-Jewish relations. The economic downturn that we've experienced here with the concomitant stress on religious institutional challenges and problems is also a reason why we tend to focus our energies on our own communities and less on the outward extension to the other. And since 9/11, the urgent need and desire of many in our communities to devote resources to enhancing connections with the Muslim community, appropriately so. Finally, I would mention the lack of parity between the Catholic theological work that has been done in this area of Jewish-Christian relations and the more meager Jewish response. And I characterize the Jewish response as being less robust, although our friend and colleague, Professor Ruth Langer, here at the Center for Christian Jewish Learning, is certainly helping in many significant ways to generate a more articulate and thoughtful set of Jewish perspectives on Christianity and Christian theology. So given all of the reasons why there seems to be less energy and attention to Catholic-Jewish relations, the question is, why should we invest more energy? Is there some compelling reason for us to take stock of where we are and recommit and focus more of our intellectual, religious, spiritual resources towards this relationship? So I'd like to offer some reasons why I think, in fact, the relationship merits more attention, both across the globe, but in particular here in Boston. First of all, our histories as religious communities have been intertwined for good and for bad for 2 millennia. It's hard for us to think about ourselves without thinking about the relationship to the other. And I say that not just from the Christian perspective, because that seems more obvious, but also from the Jewish perspective. I would also claim that we need the insights that come from engaging religious difference. The religious differences that exist among religions that have such a common commitment to covenantal theology. We are religions that share a great deal. And as Mark Heim from Andover Newton recently noted about the relationship between Christians and Jews, it is transformative for people to oscillate between being an interpreter of another religious text or religious tradition and being interpreted by another religious text or religious tradition. And we need each other to engage in that movement between interpreter and interpreted. I would also suggest that Jews in particular need to encounter the diversity and breadth of the 1 billion Catholics in the world. We are a very small and often insular people, despite the fact that people claim we control all kinds of things in the world. The reality is we're a minuscule portion of humanity, and we need to engage with a religious community that is global in a way that Judaism has never been. We need to engage that global Catholic community. And I think Catholics need to engage Judaism as the living tradition of Jesus' own religious experience and community. And there have been many, many books and essays and articles written about the Jewishness of Jesus and the importance of that to the Christian self-understanding. But I think there's something profound in that attempt to connect to Jesus through the living Jewish community. I would also submit to you that both the Catholic and Jewish communities are challenged by a postmodern global consciousness that requires an engagement specifically with one another. We're living in a time, I believe, where especially younger people want to be religious with people who are religious from another tradition. In the Jewish community, we say Jews, young Jews, especially on college campuses, want to be Jewish. They want to do Jewish things with Jews and non-Jews. And this is a part of, I think, a different sense of identity, religious identity, ethnic identity, that we both share and challenges both communities to think in new ways about how we engage one another. Certainly, Catholics and Jews share a commitment to the centrality of Scripture and the study of Scripture, to textual interpretation and a tradition and history of textual interpretation, to religious normativity. I would suggest to you that despite the age-old references to the tension between grace and law, the reality is that we both are committed to notions of grace and Hebrew chesed in its various forms, but we also have a very strong, particularly the Catholic and Jewish communities, this particularly strong commitment to the normative, to law, to religious practice and standards and modes of action. Even though we may have very, very different cultural and religious ways of expressing that commitment to normativity, normativity is something we share. We also confront similar challenges and opportunities in educating for 21st century religious leadership. And that's, I think, a particular importance here at the School of Theology and Ministry. We both confront, in many parts, certainly of the United States, dwindling congregations, mergers of parishes and synagogues. We confront a more aggressive secular critique of religion in recent years, much more unabashed in its critique. We confront a postmodern openness to religious ritual and a desire for spirituality that does not necessarily and often is specifically not connected to religious affiliation. So we have a lot of people who are interested in religion and spirituality but are, quote unquote, unchurched and want to remain unchurched. Today, we here on this beautiful Chestnut Hill campus don't have to look far to see Jews and Catholics living side by side with mutual respect and admiration. It wasn't that long ago. I've heard many stories from Jews who grew up here in Boston telling me about experiences in Dorchester where there were fistfights between Jews and particularly Irish Catholics. We're not living in those days anymore. Certainly not here. And the question is, particularly in this place, Boston College is really at the center of the two largest concentrations of Jews in the Boston area, between Brookline and Newton. It's important just to contextualize where we are. I think the question is, as we contemplate that geographic reality, the demographic reality, the question is, how can we leverage the opportunity that comes from our comfortable coexistence and interaction? We're not fighting to survive in the presence of the other or against the other. In many ways, we're thriving, and the development of this campus and this incredible institution is proof of that. But perhaps we are too comfortable. Perhaps we need some creative and productive theological tension to ignite passion and growth. And I suggest to you that one of the great benefits of our engagement with each other, as I will suggest in a minute, is to create that creative tension, which otherwise can often go undeveloped. I also want to point out that the teachings of John Paul II in particular point to the need for the Catholic-Jewish encounter. For instance, during a visit to the synagogue in Mainz in 1980, he said, "The encounter between the people of God of the Old Covenant, which has never been abrogated by God, and that of the New Covenant is also an internal dialogue in our church, similar to that between the first and second part of its Bible." It's a pretty remarkable statement. And later, in that same decade, in 1986, addressing the Jewish communities of Italy during a visit to the synagogue in Rome, he declared that the Church of Christ discovers its links with Judaism by pondering its own mystery. The Jewish religion is not extrinsic to us, but in a certain manner it is intrinsic to our religion. We have therefore a relationship with it which we do not have with any other religion. You are, speaking to the Jewish community, our favored brothers. And in a certain sense, one can say, our elder brothers. And finally, in the course of a meeting on the roots of anti-Jewish feeling among Christians in the late 1990s, Pope John Paul II said, "This people has been called and led by God, creator of heaven and earth. Their existence then is not a mere natural or cultural happening. It is a supernatural one. This people continues, in spite of everything, to be the people of the covenant, and despite human infidelity, the Lord is faithful to his covenant." These statements are remarkable to me, and they recognize the intrinsic value of Judaism to the church and to God. But interreligious understanding and engagement requires us to go beyond our own tradition and its resources. There's a big emphasis in his statements on the internality that's possible. And it calls us to explore the other in all of its complexity and particularity. Professor Mary Boyes, who's a former faculty member here at Boston College and taught here for, I think, 17 years, wrote almost 15 years ago that this interreligious work involves, quote, study in the fullest sense of that term, not only poring over unfamiliar texts or struggling to grasp an alien concept, but also learning to hear with the ears of one's heart and to appreciate what the other holds dear. In other words, there's a real challenge to a different kind of learning that's involved in this interreligious relationship. Not just dialogue, but something that partakes of the pedagogic. And in this vein, I have to mention the important work of Catherine Corneal, a professor here at BC in the Department of Theology. In her insightful work, The Impossibility of Interreligious Dialogue, which, by the way, is very clear in pointing to the possibility of interreligious dialogue. In that book, Professor Corneal develops an understanding of dialogue that further identifies 5 conditions for interreligious engagement. And here are the 5. I'm not going to go into them in the detail, but I think she's right on the money. Humility, commitment, interconnection, empathy, and hospitality are the conditions necessary for high-quality interreligious engagement. And she explores and develops the theological possibilities in each of these areas and the necessities and resources for each. And in her conclusion, she writes, and I quote, "Even though one may never presume to attain perfect understanding of the religious other, the very attempt to enter into the religious worldview and experience of the other may widen one's religious horizon and lead to the discovery of new and at times profoundly enriching forms of religious life." That certainly has been my experience, especially in my engagement with Catholics, Catholic religious educators, theologians, religious leaders. And I think the possibility of deeper self-understanding and expanding our own religious horizons as a result of this interreligious experience is a compelling reason to reinvest energy in the work that still has to be done here in Boston. She concludes that profound resonance with certain teachings or practices of the other religion may in fact point not only to the similarities with one's own religion, but also at times to areas in which one's own religion may be found wanting and in need of growth. The possibility of such growth, however, will always remain predicated upon the degree to which a religion is able to recognize truth in difference. And I think that emphasis on truth in difference is a critical element, as she describes it, of the work that still needs to be done. We need to further explore those differences because a lot of the work up until now has been to try to identify the important commonalities. And what I would like to suggest here this afternoon is that we refocus Catholic-Jewish engagement and, in fact, change the term from dialogue, which has been the prevalent term for this engagement, to interreligious or Catholic-Jewish learning. And I think the center's use of that is very, very appropriate and compelling. And I want to also suggest that the metaphor, with all due respect to the Pope John Paul II's use of this, the metaphor of siblings doesn't work well. And I tell you why. Families have a tendency to be pathological. And in fact, much of the Bible, at least the Hebrew scriptures, is taken up with all of the various nefarious elements of that pathology. And I think we'd be best in many ways, and perhaps we'd be better off if we avoided it. Elder, younger siblings, it gets very, very difficult. And I would like to suggest, and I don't think this is any great new insight, but it may be helpful to us, to move away from this sibling metaphor to the metaphor, and I'm going to borrow a kind of Talmudic word, the metaphor of chevruta, which means a learning partner, someone with whom you engage in serious learning. And in the Jewish tradition, and I think this is not only in the Jewish tradition, learning, religious learning, sacred learning is done best in pairs, not sitting alone in a library in silence, but through active conversation among people who have different understandings of a text, an experience, an idea. And I would like to suggest that the Catholic-Jewish relationship that we should be aspiring toward is that of learning partner. We need to move the metaphor from a description of the past, we were siblings and maybe even having sibling rivalry. We need to have the metaphor describe the future, what we aspire to in the relationship. And for me anyway, this learning partnership is what I hope and dream for in our relationship. And I would like to argue that to go beyond dialogue into a new era of interreligious learning and religious leadership formation that we do together, at least in part, we will need a new pedagogy. Because if in fact this is a new kind of learning, if it's going to be a truly innovative experience, then the pedagogic tools and structures that we use will have to be new. And again, referring to Mary Boyes and her colleague Sarah Lee of Hebrew Union College, who co-authored the book Christians and Jews in Dialogue, Learning in the Presence of the Other, they have taught me a great deal about the pedagogy necessary for interreligious learning. And they identify 4 principles. Number 1 is study in the presence of the other is fundamental to interreligious learning. It's not enough to study about the other without the other present. We have to actually study together in the same room. Secondly, that the process of learning is a key element, and it's not just about content. It's about a certain kind of process, and that process needs to be inextricably linked to the content. Pedagogic content knowledge, as one theoretician has called it. Third, the learning environment must enable participants to risk crossing borders, religious borders, and integrate their learning into their religious identity. It's got to be an environment which people feel safe actually exploring the religious otherness. And I don't mean necessarily trying on, new religious practices or praying in other people's faith, language, or tradition, but the ability to converse and engage and think without what are often the constraints of our communities. And finally, that interreligious learning must help participants get inside the religious tradition of the other. And this is what I think Catherine Corneille calls empathy. The ability actually to begin to think in the religious terms of the other. And it's not easy to do. It really takes a stretch of imagination, which is, by the way, a human capacity underappreciated in religious dialogue. The imagination must be engaged in this work. So what I would like to suggest is that in addition to what Catherine Corneille and Mary Boyce and Sarah Lee have pointed to in terms of the conditions, the principles, I would like to add two what I call capacities to their lists. The first is the capacity to hold contradictory conceptions. I actually think that that's an intellectual challenge. How do you deal with different conceptions of God, different conceptions of grace, of law, of prayer? How can you, in your head, imagine these contradictory ways of being? And we have to develop the capacity. And quite frankly, I think part of the challenge of learning in the 21st century, beyond the religious realm, but including the religious realm, is in fact the expansion of this capacity to hold contradictions in our head. Secondly, is the capacity to give covenantal critique. Often dialogue is about sharing, it's about getting to know one another. But I would submit to you that there's something beyond the dialogue, which is why the dialogue part of it is not enough for me. In learning together, at least in the traditional Jewish conception, you have to challenge the other person. If they say something that doesn't make sense to you, or you don't understand, or you need clarification, or you want to challenge them to think about the internal logic of what they're suggesting, that's part of the partnership. That's part of why you're paired with someone else. You don't just want to think about yourself, but it doesn't do any good just to listen and nod your head and say, that's great, wonderful. You also have to say, that doesn't make sense to me, or I don't understand how that's consistent, or what does that ultimately produce in terms of religious life and religious experience. So let me just very briefly suggest that this notion of holding contradictory concepts is a very important fundamental mode of learning in the Jewish tradition, particularly the Talmudic tradition. And there's a very famous passage in Babylonian Talmud tractate Chagiga, where the rabbis of the Talmud pose a fundamental religious question. They ask the question, well, if in Jewish tradition there are all these discussions in which one set of rabbis says something is pure, some object is pure and can be used for religious purposes. Another group says, no, that same object is impure, cannot be used for religious purposes. Or one group of rabbis says something is permitted to do, and another group of rabbis says, no, that same act is not permitted to do. The student often is puzzled and says, well, how am I supposed to understand Judaism? How am I supposed to understand Torah? How am I supposed to understand God's will? There are these contradictory perspectives that I'm confronting and I'm learning. And the answer the Talmud gives to this important question is a very interesting one. The Talmud says, well, first of all, the source for all of these different perspectives is the same God and the same messenger of God. It comes from one shepherd. But more importantly, our task as learners is to make our ear, the Talmud says, like a hopper, like a funnel, and to take in all of these different opposing concepts, and to enable our heart to discern, to be open to these various different ways of understanding. And that even though you may have to make a judgment, who's right and who's wrong, what do we do? Is this object pure? Is it not pure? Can it be used for sacrament? Whatever it is. You have to make a judgment in life. But that the goal of learning is actually to hold these different perspectives because they all reflect different aspects of God's wisdom and will. And our job is to try to expand our understanding of God. So, again, I think it's true also in the interreligious context, and I'd like to point to a passage that I discovered recently by a 16th century rabbi and exegete, Eliezer Ashkenazi, who had a very interesting life, lived all over the world, and found himself in many Catholic-dominated contexts. And he, in his Bible commentary, Maaseh Hashem, the works of God, in commenting on the Tower of Babel story that I know you all are familiar with, he suggests that the problem that God had with the Tower of Babel and the city and the people was not just that they had a unified spoken language, which is what the text seems to suggest on the surface, but that they had a common and coerced monolithic theology, religious language, that they thought the same about God, and that God thought that was dangerous and undesirable. And so he dispersed them. And the reason why God didn't like that monolithic theological perspective is that, according to Rabbi Ashkenazi, when you have different ideas about God in which people develop different religious perspectives, there's the possibility that through debate and discussion, he uses the word vikuach, it's really a aggressive discussion, that through thinking about these different perspectives that emerge, truth is more likely to be discovered. And this is a very American idea too. In the free marketplace of ideas, you're more apt to come to some religion or some insight about something, in this case about religious ideas. And in fact, Ashkenazi goes on to say, do you know why we're introduced to Abraham in the biblical narrative right after the Tower of Babel narrative? He says, because once God disperses the people and there develops this religious diversity, Abraham can come along, sample these different religious ideas, think about it, and actually develop a new, more profound, more true, monolithic, at least in this understanding, concept, religious idea. And of course, it's that religious discovery of Abraham that we, both Catholics and Jews, as spiritual children of Abraham, have inherited as the basis of our religious life and thought. It's only because of that diversity and the ability to explore that diversity that this new idea emerges. So, interreligious learning that strives towards a goal of covenantal partnership, again, partnering in the learning process, as described by another important teacher, Rabbi Irving Greenberg, in his book For the Sake of Heaven and Earth, should, in my view, develop the capacity for covenantal critique. Our goal in interreligious learning should not just be to convince the other that our religious traditions are right, but to help the other consider carefully the implications and ramifications of his or her own religious worldview. At its best, then, interreligious learning will allow one to lovingly challenge the other as a way to deepen the understanding of self and other in a spirit of partnership and concern for our mutual growth. So let me conclude by stating what I think is the practical outcome of some of these ideas. First of all, that Boston, in particular, as the great academic center of the United States, should focus this Catholic-Jewish relationship on the learning experience, as the critical place for the intersection between Catholic and Jews. We should move from theologians in dialogue to seminarians as learning partners. And that is an important move and one that really hasn't taken place yet, at least in my experience. There is a great opportunity to develop a new collaboration in the formation of religious leadership that, to borrow from the title of Catholic theologian Peter Pfan's important book, and I know he was here just at BC a while ago, educates toward being religious interreligiously. That challenge, which is I think a challenge we share, can be seriously engaged between our schools in this community. And I mean specifically between the School of Theology and Ministry here at BC and Hebrew College. We should, in fact, take advantage of the establishment of the School of Theology and Ministry here at BC with its incredible proximity to Hebrew College just down the road. I mean, it used to be the Jesuits were trained way across the river, but they've come to cross onto our side, this side, and together with the Center for Christian and Jewish Learning, we have an opportunity now, we're a mile apart, literally. We have an opportunity to influence Catholic and Jewish religious leadership in their formative stages and formation, and to think about what does it mean to train 21st century religious leaders to be religious interreligiously. And 3 areas of interreligious learning, I think, can be developed. I'm actually attracted to the number 3 for a lot of reasons, but I'm one of those Jews who actually does not find the Trinity inscrutable. I'm actually very attracted to it. I think there's much to say about it and for it. And in fact, I happen to live here in Newton Center on Trinity Terrace. And people say, oh, that's, kind of odd. I say, no, that's actually religiously very compelling. So here are the 3. Number 1, leadership training. The School of Theology's focus on religious, educational, and lay leadership for the church has parallels with Hebrew College's rabbinical school, School of Education, and School of Jewish Music and Adult Learning. We at Hebrew College have begun to experiment with interreligious leadership training through our partnership with Andover Newton Theological School, informing the Center for Interreligious and Communal Leadership Education. But I have to say, at least in these walls, but I know it's being broadcast, that without a Catholic partner, I can say this at least for Hebrew College, especially here in Boston, we lack an important voice and partner in interreligious learning. And so I think the opportunity to engage Hebrew College and Boston College is a really important, significant opportunity. I can imagine not just the opportunity for cross-registration, which is already afforded through our BTI membership, but a joint course between Boston College, the School of Theology and Ministry, and Hebrew College on, for instance, sin and sacrifice in our 2 religious traditions, prayer and penance, or even a joint course team taught that explores close readings from our hermeneutic traditions on Isaiah or on the Psalms. Catholic priests and rabbis serving congregations and religious institutions beyond the confines of higher theological education, I'm talking about priests and rabbis in the field, should also be engaged in interreligious learning together, and we can do more on that, a lot more. Alumni of our institutions who serve in the area, one of the greatest centers of medical research, could be brought together to explore Catholic and Jewish perspectives on medical ethics, religious texts and practices that guide us as we minister to the sick. My experience traveling to Israel with a Carmelite nun many years ago and having a discussion with her about the role of Elijah in her religious life while standing on top of Mount Carmel had such a profound impact on me. And not because I began to think of Elijah in the terms that she engaged Elijah, but because I had a kindred spirit in a person of a different religious faith with whom I shared a real bond with this prophetic figure and legacy. And I felt, in fact, I came home. Not that long later, my wife and I had a baby boy. We named him Elijah. That kind of experience, which I had when I was already a rabbi in the field, is something that we can give religious leaders in this community. We can travel together to Israel and other places. We can learn together, and we can, in fact, inform and transform our own religious life and leadership. And we can do a lot more than what we're doing now with priests and rabbis learning together. And finally, I think there's an opportunity to do something in which synagogues and churches form partnerships, not just places where we theologians or people who like to deal with religious education get together, but learning in the pews. And in fact, Peter Phan from Georgetown, in his book, quotes a Christian theologian, Clark Williamson, as saying the following. And of course, Peter Phan endorses this. He says, "Unless education, preaching, and worship in local congregations are appropriate to the good news of God's all-inclusive love and God's command that justice be done to all of those whom God loves, none of the church's fine theological pronouncements on relationships between Christians and Jews will in the end be worth a fig." We have to bring it to the pews because we have a lot of good stuff that's happening at the upper levels of theology, but we have to bring it into the life of congregants and congregations. So serious lay adults need to be engaged in interreligious learning if we are to go beyond the theological dialogue of the last 50 years. A collaboration between BC, the Archdiocese, and Hebrew College, with our extensive network of adult learning programs and deep connections with area congregations, could pioneer interreligious learning among adults, especially those who serve in leadership capacities. And that learning may spark a new interest in religious growth among our brightest and most committed lay leaders in both communities. Because my experience is that interreligious learning can be some of the most stimulating religious learning we can provide. So in conclusion, I call on us to continue the sacred work of interreligious learning and to take up the charge articulated by Pope Benedict to further grow and develop our relationship. To do something significant in this work will take courage and creativity, not just more of the same. And creativity, in my experience, is often fostered by confronting difference and dissonance. The challenge is for us to generate creativity instead of conflict from our differences. The holiday of Rosh Hashanah that the Jewish community just celebrated a few days ago commemorates the creation of the human being. And Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, one of the great Talmudists and religious thinkers of the 20th century, who lived for more than 60 years just a little more than a mile from this campus, and with whom I had the privilege of learning at the very end of his life, wrote in his important book, Halachic Man, that the height of religious and ethical perfection to which Judaism aspires is man as creator. I think we, Catholics and Jews, are called to be creative in this moment, creative in our commitment to interreligious learning. And for Soloveitchik, that creativity, that act of creativity, is actually an imperative of imitatio Dei. So in that spirit, may we, Catholics and Jews, both walk in God's ways, sometimes along the same path, sometimes learning about the path we did not take, but when at all possible, walking side by side and helping each other experience and generate that creative gesture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi Lehmann, for those deeply insightful and challenging words to us when you were speaking about the dysfunctional family. In the words of the founder of Methodism, John Wesley, my heart was strangely warmed. So, it's now my pleasure to introduce Rabbi and Professor Ruth Langer, Associate Professor of Theology here at Boston College and Associate Director of the Center for Jewish Christian Learning. Ruth will introduce our respondent to Rabbi Lehmann's lecture. Dr. Langer.
Good afternoon or good evening, whichever it is at this point. It's my pleasure to welcome back to Boston College and to introduce Father David Michael. Father David Michael was ordained a priest to the Archdiocese of Boston in 1986, and he served since then in several parishes in the Archdiocese, but I first met him, and he began his career here, I believe, as Catholic chaplain at Brandeis University, serving there from 1997 to 2005. He's currently pastor of the St. Joseph Parish in Needham, but since 1997, he has also served as the Associate Director of the Archdiocese of Boston's Office for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs. Indeed, he's often been our point person and our go-to person in connection with the Archdiocese on any issue having to do with Catholic-Jewish relations. He is responsible for facilitating the ongoing relationship between the Archdiocese and the Jewish community, the Muslim community, and other communities of faith. He meets regularly with local Jewish religious leaders and works closely with the leadership of the Islamic Council of New England. He oversees several ongoing projects of mutual collaboration between local Jewish and Catholic, and Muslim and Catholic communities. Over the past years, he's also organized many continuing education opportunities for Catholic clergy and religious professionals, especially concerning responsible preaching and teaching of the Christian scriptures and things that have been problematic in the relationship between Catholics and Jews. He's also been a participant in numerous conferences and interreligious dialogues, and he continues to be a frequent guest speaker, respondent, and representative of the Archdiocese of Boston at events pertaining to Catholic Jewish and Catholic Muslim relations. Welcome, and we invite Father David Michael to offer a response to Rabbi Lehmann's lecture.
Thank you, Ruth. It's a delight to be back among friends. During this time of these holy days, we wish all of our Jewish brothers and sisters blessings and peace. You've asked me to limit my response to 15 minutes, and I will do my very best to summarize my thoughts in three categories, Danny, in response to what you said. I'd like to spend just a few moments characterizing the relationship that actually does exist here in the Archdiocese and with the Jewish community. I'd like to take a few minutes to address the Church's magisterium, because I think that has to be a necessary piece of response. And then finally, your suggestions for new paradigms for our engagement, our encounter. It's always tricky to characterize a relationship, of course, because relationships are always complex. In your characterization of local relations between Christians and Jews as cooperative but inactive, I take your point to mean that, with the happy exception, as you mentioned, of the Archdiocesan ADL New Directions program, there's not a lot otherwise happening in the way of regular, formal, and ongoing exchanges between Christians and Jews. My response to that is yes, but. I wouldn't want that assessment to be misconstrued to mean that we're at a standstill in the Christian-Jewish agenda locally. In fact, a number of things are happening, and I'd like to describe a few of those since that's the work that I often do. For example, this past June, I helped to arrange the visit of, and I was present with, Cardinal O'Malley when he spoke at Temple Sinai in Marblehead. This is the third time that the Cardinal has been the guest speaker at a local Jewish venue, and as with the other two occasions when I was present with him also, the full audience received the Cardinal and his message with palpable enthusiasm and very deep appreciation. It was a very important occasion for him. This past Lent, on the Catholic side, I was invited to speak at two different Catholic parishes, and that was because on Palm Sunday we were reading the Passion according to Matthew, And a local pastor asked me if I would speak to his congregation on how we can tell that story faithfully without the anti-Jewish potential that's in the text. So I've done the same kind of, Ruth mentioned, I've done the same kind of programs for Catholic religious educators on a number of occasions at the invitation, especially of our Office for Religious Education in the Archdiocese, and also for New Directions. And a few times I've done the same with Jewish educators as well, a kind of respondent on these issues. Last spring, I spent over 2 hours with a group of about 20 very bright and articulate students and their rabbi teacher from the Gann Academy who came to visit me out in Needham, a couple of hours. Wonderful exchange, allowing the students to ask whatever questions they wanted to. On behalf of the Archdiocese, I work very closely with the Massachusetts Council of Churches on our Christian-Jewish relations, so there's a broader kind of engagement there. Our primary partners in the relationship, that is Mass Council of Churches and Archdiocese, have been the local Jewish agencies, and I still call on these leaders and these agencies freely at any time when I need to talk with them. I would love to be able to explore more possibilities. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, to create opportunities for exchanges between, for example, the Massachusetts Board of Rabbis or some of the Orthodox rabbis and the priests of the Archdiocese of Boston. We have an official Christian-Jewish dialogue that's been in partnership with the American Jewish Committee and the Mass Council of Churches. We found that that dialogue brings with it all kinds of challenges that are reflective of the complexities of our internal lives and of our relationships with one another. And I think we've struggled with kind of the asymmetry that's involved in bringing a secular agency in discussion with the Archdiocese of Boston and then a council of churches, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, we did not meet last year, but we realized a new need to renew this dialogue. Also, on the ground, a real challenge to our, among the others, which I concur with you, but our challenge to sustaining institutional relationships has been the turnover in a relationship in many years locally. For example, 2 executive directors of the Massachusetts Council of Churches, one of our primary partners, have retired in the past 4 years. So we're just in the position of welcoming a new executive director. I was part of that search committee to welcome the new director. And of course, Nancy Kaufman, who was very dynamic, and the Jewish Community Relations Council took another job, and so forth. So there are a lot of other things that are happening. On the 10th anniversary of 9/11, I was part of a large group of religious communities that gathered together in Boston for that observance, and so forth. So the relationship is more complex than is represented by formal ongoing programs between the Archdiocese and the Jewish community agencies, for example. I'd like to speak for just a moment on the magisterium of the church, and here, of course, we can get into a whole complex thing, and we don't have the time. I would suggest that in addition to, of course, the decades of statements and praiseworthy gestures that were made by Pope John Paul II concerning our relationship with Jews, that we must also consider the emerging teaching of Benedict, who seems to me has been pulling together different strands in very interesting, and I might add surprising ways. First, let's get this out on the table briefly. The Good Friday prayer, there are some issues here. The Good Friday prayer, you mentioned some of these, a controversy over Bishop Williamson, and going back several years, the promulgation of Dominus Jesus, among other controversies. I don't want to gloss over the consternation and confusion that these have caused, but I do think it's necessary to see them in a proper context in order for us to better understand what they mean and what they mean for our relationship. That's more than I can possibly do now, but let me just suggest a way of thinking about this. It seemed to me that an important moment of progress for the Catholic Church in the emerging dialogue with the Jews can be found in the 1974 guidelines and suggestions for implementing Nostra Aetate, where we have this line: Christians must, quote, must strive to learn by what essential traits the Jews define themselves in light of their own religious experience. Now that meant that as a result of our relatively new encounter with the Jews post-Vatican II, we were beginning to understand Judaism as a living religion. We were no longer saying to the Jews, we know who you are because we read the New Testament. That relationship and dialogue, therefore, are built on the trust that is built through self-disclosure in an attitude of respect for conscience. And so Catholics will need to listen respectfully to Jews, tell us who they are, and if there is to be mutuality in the relationship, Jews, I would suggest, will need to listen respectfully to Catholics, doing the same. I wish I could say, as you pointed out also, that this is easy. In fact, it is not. While it is possible For example, as we know, part of the complexity in our relationship is while it's possible for Jews who belong to different streams of Judaism to interpret themselves Jewishly, if you will, in sometimes even contradictory ways, that's not so easy for Catholics. Catholics are bound by a faith that's expressed in an authoritative and received tradition which defines us and constitutes our belief and practice. So when Cardinal Casper, in that recent wonderful volume, Christ Jesus and the Jewish People, his foreword, which is marvelous, I'm reading the book, but I want you to know the foreword is worth the price of the book, the brief foreword by Cardinal Casper. He says that after such a long history of estrangement, and in view of the remaining fundamental differences between Judaism and Christianity, it was inevitable that misunderstandings and controversies would arise and continue to arise. So I think that we look at what Benedict is now saying. I thought the same thing as you. I read his whole address to the Jewish community in Germany just last week. He gave this, and I think it was a marvelous address. Let me just quickly lift out ways, because I want to get to your point about a new engagement. He reiterated his conviction that the path of fraternity and friendship launched by Nostra Aetate is irrevocable. I mean, he very, very clearly said. They said that also at the synagogue in Rome when he visited there. In surprising ways, he seems to be weaving together strands of his thought. For example, his 2 volumes of Jesus of Nazareth, I think, are going to be very important in this regard. He has a way of reading the scriptures, and that's we would have to have a discussion about how he reads the scriptures. But I think as a man who's charged, for example, as a pastor of a parish, with preaching a living faith and not just the results of exegesis, I think that he points the way in some ways that were kind of surprising to me. He asserts that the relationship, of course, between our 2 covenants is complex. Paul struggled with this. We can expect no less of ourselves. But he speaks some surprising ways, for example, of fulfillment. By the way, I think that this is often where we trip up on when we could speak of fulfillment. I don't think, it is possible for us to speak of the relationship between the 2 covenants in ways other than in the categories of fulfillment. We also cannot not interpret our relationship, the relationship in this way, that fulfillment is itself a scriptural category of interpretation, one that Jesus applies to himself. But the Pope understands this fulfillment in this very rich way that, for example, the Pontifical Biblical Commissions document Jewish people and the sacred scriptures in the Christian Bible, this very nuanced way. He writes in this same address to the Jewish community, when Jesus' conflict with the Judaism of his time is superficially interpreted as a breach with the Old Covenant, it tends to be reduced to the idea of a liberation that mistakenly views the Torah merely as a slavish enactment of rituals and outward observances. Yet, in actual fact, the Sermon on the Mount does not abolish the Mosaic Law, but reveals its hidden possibilities and allows more radical demands to emerge. So he's taken this notion of fulfillment, not simply as this easy default position, I think, for Catholics, that fulfillment means abrogation, but in this more richly nuanced way. He takes that very seriously throughout his analysis of the life of Jesus and the meaning of Jesus in Jesus of Nazareth in the 2 volumes that have come out so far. He speaks of the legitimacy of Jewish readings of the scriptures and urges Christians to accept that, but also to share our readings together, etc. The enduring mission of the Jews remains. He says that also very, very clearly, that there's a special witness that this is not abolished, the special mission of the Jews in the world. So there are many ways in which he's developing his thought, and I think that could be some rich exchange possibilities for us. But you wanted to speak about the new paradigms for our relationship. So is it a time for new paradigms? And I would say, yes, I concur with you. I believe that it is. The Catholic Church will probably always have to wrestle with what the encounter with Judaism means for us, not just in terms of correcting past distortions, but also positively in terms of understanding deeply our own mystery and the sometimes successful, often messy, and occasionally disheartening process so far in our relationship can be seen as an inevitable working out of the fundamentals, as Cardinal Casper notes. Let's not lose sight of how far we've come, as you correctly point out. When I speak with Jewish audiences, and sometimes they're distressed over different issues, I'll say, well, would you rather live in a pre- or a post-Nostra Aetate world? in your relationship with the church. Much has been accomplished in 45 years. You don't have to, by the way, convince me of the power of an encounter to transform. As Ruth mentioned, I was chaplain at Brandeis University full-time for almost 9 years. The question that I raise is, are there in fact Jews who want to or feel an innate need to meet Catholics? Let's keep it to Catholics at this point. As believers, if we can assume a kind of common understanding of what we mean by that, right? And importantly, to what end? That's the question that I would raise. You have this beautiful vision of the possibilities that are out there. Are there Jews who want to? In my experience of trying to bring local Christians and Jews into dialogue and relationship, they're a challenge, as we know. The first question always emerges, well, who dialogues with whom? It's a question of parity or symmetry that's not always an easy one to answer. Which Christians speaking to which Jews? The Orthodox, as you know, are cautious about theological exchanges. The Jewish agencies are secular. Often their concern is political advocacy. We can build relations and cooperate with the agencies, but often Catholics find that the agencies are not the place for religious conversation. We know this. There's a need for prologue to dialogue. The New Directions educators discovered that even people of goodwill can't simply be placed in a situation of a new encounter without adequate preparation for the encounter. The preparation in terms of the history, the presuppositions that we bring to our encounter. What are issues of concerns to Jews and issues of concern to Christians? And the fact that we do speak a different religious language, that Christians often can speak of an intimacy with God, a relationship with the Lord in ways that is difficult, or maybe even impossible for Jews. I do think that it's important for Catholics and for other Christians to understand that complex span of Jewish self-interpretation, just as it is for Jews to do the same in reverse for Christians. So while we often, as Catholics, we have to remember this, that Jews have this way, this whole span of Jewish self-interpretation. Sometimes I have to remind my Jewish brothers and sisters of the same thing apropos of the Christian community. When they will make a blanket statement, Christians want to convert us away. We say, which Christians? We need to get at that kind of thing. So all of that, there are other things that I could say. Can I see a potential for this kind of an encounter to deepen and transform us both? Absolutely. I'd like to mention, by the way, that don't forget our seminarians across the street. By the way, I have a lovely brochure on the joys of diocesan priesthood that I'm happy to share with you afterwards. But don't forget our brothers and sisters who are in the seminary across the way, and also, very importantly, the Master of Arts in Ministry and the Master of Theological Studies for the new evangelization for our lay ecclesial ministers in the Catholic Church. These are, I think, are ripe for this kind of wonderful encounter. Could, for example, your cousin, Alan, with whom I work so closely, I remember Alan telling me about his wonderful retreat experience with Catholic and Jewish educators, which I think was sponsored by Notre Dame and some Jewish partner, Alan. Would that be a kind of a model, a retreat experience, an institute for local clergy? Because I think you're right. I think that we need to bring this to our local clergy, to the people who are in the pews. So finally, let me conclude with this. Benedict, in this recent address to the Jewish community, offered several reasons for Christians and Jews to continue to encounter one another in friendship and dialogue. He spoke of the need to understand God's word and will correctly. He spoke of strengthening our common hope in God in the midst of an increasingly secularized society. For without this hope, society loses its humanity. And he spoke of Jews and Christians certainly having a shared responsibility for the development of society, which always includes a religious dimension. So yes, we could see wonderful potentials. And I, for one, am very, very happy that we are in an entirely different world, post-Nostra Aetate, post-Vatican II, than we were 50 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. I'm going to ask Danny and Dave, do you want to respond to any of the, why don't we turn these around here? Are these on? Yes, they are. Do you want to respond to it? I think he answered some of your questions. I don't know if you want to respond.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you, David, for those comments. And I agree with you. I think that there are some things happening there certainly aren't enough things happening to satisfy me. And if you're looking for Jews who are interested in this engagement, and I know sometimes it is hard to find them, here's one. I know there's another here. I know there's another over there. And we have networks of people who I think share that common interest and commitment and passion to engage in this kind of interreligious learning. I can only speak for myself in saying that as the head of an institution that has graduate students and hundreds of high school students and hundreds of adult learners throughout the community, I think we can assert leadership and let our constituencies know that this is something vitally important, both to our own religious growth and to the shared mission and interests that we have in terms of our impact on the world as religious people. And I think that there's an opportunity here. Again, there aren't that many places where the proximity, physical proximity, is so great, and in which the academic resources, both here and across the street at St. John's and at Hebrew College and Brandeis and other places, allow us to draw upon incredible talent. And I think there is an interest, I can tell you from the students that I work with, both rabbinical students and graduate students, they have grown up thinking about their own religious growth and development in relationship to religious others. And there's something actually artificial and almost inauthentic to them about doing this in a kind of more insular and isolated way. And I think that presents an incredible opportunity for us. So what I would say in general response is, I think you pointed some very important things that are happening. I think they tend to happen in these kinds of organizational structures that are not the most helpful, and certainly as someone who's interested in the learning side of it, I think we can do it with better and different networks together. I think your comment about the magisterium is helpful, and I think to have a serious group of people looking at both what Pope Benedict is doing in your read, this nuance bringing together of different strands in his theology, and what's happening amongst Jewish thinkers and theologians in new ways, I think that would be of great import and benefit to all of us. And finally, I would just say, so let's do some stuff. I believe that we can create some realities on the ground. I think we have institutions that don't have a lot of the baggage that might sometimes encumber and make it difficult. And I am here to say that I want to engage in this partnership in a rich and robust way, and I'm ready to get started whenever we can sit down and fantasize and plan.
We have a couple minutes for questions. Brian, do we have any mics? Does anyone in the audience have some questions for either Rabbi Lehmann or Father Michael? We do have a mic here. Good, I think there's a lady right here.
I'm just an ordinary housewife and stay-at-home mom, but I experienced something very moving last autumn. My daughter's at Mount Alvernia, I'm a practicing Catholic, but I was out for a walk, and all of these men were carrying around vegetation, and I was fascinated. I was dead curious. Nosy is another word for it. So I finally plucked up my courage, and I asked this man what he was doing. And we had the most fascinating conversation as he explained to me about the wilderness and the tents in the wilderness. And at the very end, he said, "Thank you for being interested." And I was stunned because, of course, I was interested. And then I don't believe in coincidences. A while later, we were reading Abraham Heschel in my book group, and through one person knowing another, we ended up being invited to the Wellesley synagogue. In this country it's called Temple, and we were. The rabbi was just gorgeous to us as he explained what Purim was about, and the symbolism or the opening of the doors to let in the nighttime. I know that I don't have any understanding, so I probably sound very simplistic about it all. But I would love if on the ground level, at my level, say the local temple would just offer classes to people like me to understand the Hebrew scriptures and see it through the eyes of the people who worship and study this day in, day out. And all of what you were talking about was so high level. At my level, I would love to just be invited to a class in the local temple, if that were possible.
I think it is possible. I think it is going to take, first of all, an appreciation for the interest that you expressed. And I sort of share the sentiment of the man you stopped on the street, thank you for being interested, because I think there's often an assumption that, people are busy with their own religious affairs, if they have them, and don't have a lot of energy to explore the religious other. So there is something, I think, wonderful and to be appreciated in that curiosity that you expressed. So part of it is just being aware of that you're not alone and that other people have that interest. I actually think, though, that instead of just having synagogues or other institutions open up and say, we're both interested and maybe even creating particular structures for people to enter into this, Jewish learning experience, I think we can actually structure paradigms of learning in which we are having Catholics and Jews, or Jews and other Christians paired, sitting down together. And I can tell you from my own experience, and I think this is true for the Jewish community, that there would be incredible re-engagement of the Jews with their own traditions, scripture and otherwise, and the same thing on the Catholic side, because the reality is that when you're forced to articulate and help another person understand, who comes with what you call the naivete, but the reality is it's just a desire to know, that generates a tremendous inner thirst for our own self-knowledge. And there's nothing, I think, better to spur on that interest. So I think that there's great mutual benefit. I just think that we need to do it really in a very intentional, thoughtful, structured way. And to pair a parish and a synagogue and say, we really want to create some serious adult learning. My institution was involved in a very innovative adult learning program for Jews over the last 15 to 18 years. And I've suggested, okay, we've sort of been there, done that. It was very important and successful. Maybe now it's time to do a similar kind of adult learning program over a year or two span, specifically for Jews and Catholics together, because that's a frontier that we really haven't yet conquered. And here in Boston, I think we've got the talent to do it.
Great. Another question, just that there's a lady in the back, Brian.
Thank you both very much. It was wonderful, very enlightening and inspiring. My question is for Father David Michael. Father, you mentioned that you believe that there are certain things that need to be done before one can enter into dialogue or even a learning experience with the other. Could you articulate some of that, please? So to be prepared, how one can be prepared for some
Prologue
of
to
that.
dialogue, right. I think that there are all kinds of presuppositions that we bring to our relationship. They're natural. And if we don't know that, we're not aware of that, I think that when you put people into an interreligious encounter, sometimes they get tripped up because they don't even know that they have a way that they read a text, for example. How do we understand? There's a very specific way as Catholics that we understand how we read, or at least how we don't read a text. I would think some of the sensitivity toward the history of our relationship so far, and to use the title of the book I'm rereading, The Anguish of the Jews, and the way in which Jews so readily know that history, and Christians are often unaware of that history. I'll give a perfect example of this. I was the pastor for 5 years of a beautiful parish called the Parish of St. John Chrysostom. Yeah, exactly. And every time I would say that in a group of Jews, they would all kind of look at me like, well, isn't this rather ironic? And yet my Catholic, beloved Catholic parishioners, I think, probably to a person, were unaware of John Chrysostom and his part in the development of a very unfortunate theological teaching against the Jews. So just to bring something like that. So there's a whole way in which people have to at least have that aware. I'm just uncomfortable about throwing Catholics and Jews into a kind of intentional experience without some type of prologue to it. I don't know exactly how we'd work it out, but
Yeah, I mean, let me say that while I understand and respect and in many ways agree, I actually think we just need to throw ourselves into it. And the reason why, for the simple reason, because I think there is danger to it, and I think we can trip each other up and we can cause all kinds of confusion. I actually think that people walking away from a session in which they said, wow, like, I better bone up on my own church father history, or I have to really understand what it means when I say in the Jewish prayers, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That tripping up actually may be the best fodder for learning. And I also, as an educator, my tendency is if you scaffold too much, you end up never actually getting to the building. And especially with adults, because we don't have a lot of time. And, people get bored with the scaffolding, and even if they were spending years at doing it, that might work, but they don't. They have an hour once a week kind of thing. And I think you just got to jump in and put a text in front of them and see what happens. And then maybe there's going to be not the prologue, but, the need for some afterward in which we actually unpack some of the issues that emerge.
There's a lady over right here, Brian.
Thank you. I just want to comment on two of the things you said. I worked for many years as a chaplain at St. Elizabeth's Medical Center. And one of the greatest things for us was when we had 2 rabbinical students in our CPE program. And it was serious learning for us and serious learning for them, and wonderful for our staff and our patients. And also, I was on the medical ethics committee for many years with many fine Jewish physicians and fine Muslim physicians. And there was wonderful discussion causing us to think, what do I believe? What have I always thought here? And our Jewish physician became chairman of our medical ethics committee. But those are great experiences.
Yeah, I can certainly say that our rabbinical students at Hebrew College come back from their CPE experiences, doing pastoral, clinical training with incredible stories about what they've learned, and most often that's led by Christians who are serving in medical establishments, but the Jews have such great insight, and a lot of religious horizons are opened up as a result of that. And just secondly, I think the opportunity to work in the medical ethics area in particular, because of Boston's Mecca of medicine, if I can use that phrase here, is really something that we should take advantage of. My wife happens to be a director of the Center for Bioethics at Brigham and Women's Hospital, so I have some insight into how that medical ethics world works. And the voice of religious folks on those ethics committees and in working with patients in pastoral care, and certainly as priests, ministers, and rabbis, it's really important work. And we have real differences on this stuff, real differences. But it's important to explore them, and I think that will be a very productive window into some of the religious otherness that we often sort of just skip around.
One more question. Right here, sorry, ma'am.
About
12 years ago, I took a course at Boston College Institute for Learning and Retirement on Center Street called World Religions. And at least a third of the people in the class were Jewish, and a lot of us were Catholics. But every week we'd have the most important representative we could find from a different faith come to address us and engage in dialogue. And the point I want to make is somewhat relevant, but I remember those discussions still, a great deal of them from 12 years ago, because they were meaningful and people engaged, and I think a lot of us generated ideas we might not have had in a setting that wasn't that open. And I don't know what kind of motto that could be, but it seems to have some relevance I wanted to mention.
Well, I think certainly the power of that and the fact that it's still very much alive for you is indicative of, the influence and impact that this can have. And the question is how do we just proliferate those kinds of opportunities, and how do we do them in various settings? And I would suggest, again, there's something significant about creating settings in which people come as members of religious communities. So not just as individuals coming to a BC adult learning program, but actually congregations and parishes in some ways, or seminaries, right, but with that commitment and with the openness to, to really hear and try to understand the other.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Rabbi Lehmann and Father Michael for an excellent discussion tonight. Thank you very much. I would be remiss if I did not publicly thank Barbara Radke and Melinda Donovan, so here, and the lady sitting right in front of the camera. Please thank them for putting this together.